أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والقاتل لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillah, we have a blessed gathering today. We have two absolutely amazing speakers that are here today, and I will introduce them to you. But as every occasion when it's to do with the Deen of Islam, it's best to start with the blessed recitation of the Holy Quran. Alhamdulillah, we have our dear brother Qari Hassan Rasool to come and to start the ceremony, the recitation of the Holy Quran. Bismillah.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله. وتلك الأمثال نضربها للناس وتلك الأمثال نضربها للناس لعلهم يتفكرون. هو الذي لا إله إلا هو. عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم. هو الله الذي لا
المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم الله أكبر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد صدق الله العظيم.
Okay, Sidi Hassan Rasul for the beautiful recitation of the Quran. Now I'm going to introduce one of our two auspicious guests. Imam Dawud Walid is currently the Executive Director of the Michigan chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a chapter of America's largest advocacy and civil liberties organization for American Muslims, and a member of the Michigan Muslim Community Council Imams Committee. Walid has lectured at over 70 institutions of higher learning in North America and abroad about Islam and social justice, including at Harvard University, the University of the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas and St. Croix campuses, and the University of Bamako in Mali, as well as spoken at the 2008 and 2011 Congressional Black Caucus Conventions alongside prominent speakers such as Reverend Jesse Jackson, Congressman Keith Ellison. He previously served as an imam at Masjid Wali Muhammad in Detroit and the Boston American Islamic Center in Hamtramck, Michigan, and continues to deliver sermons and lectures at Islamic centers across the United States and Canada. Imam Walid has studied under qualified scholars the discipline of Arabic grammar and morphology, foundation of Islamic jurisprudence, and science of the exegesis of the Holy Quran. He was also the co-author of the book Censoring Black Narrative, Black Muslims Nobles Among the Early Pious Muslims. He was a 2011-2012 Fellow of the University of Southern California, American Muslim Civil Leadership Institute, and a 2014-15 Fellow of the Wayne State Law School Detroit Action Equity Lab Theory. Walid served in the United States Navy under honorable conditions, earning 2 United States Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medals while deployed abroad. He has also received awards of recognition from the City Council of Detroit and Hamtramck. from the mayor of Lansing, as well as a number of religious and community organizations. Without further ado, I give you Imam Dawud Walid.
Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله القائل إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصب الحق بالحق وهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره مقدار العظيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العظيم. First of all, let me say it's really an honor and a privilege to be here with you this evening, this afternoon here at Rumi's Cave. And alhamdulillah, you all have a lot of activity going on here. We came here at the right time with your winter vest, and it's really beautiful to see some of your smiling faces, or at least your smiling eyes behind masks. And with Allah's permission, I will just share a little bit on the topic before passing on to my brother from another mother, Sidi Bilal. And for those of you who don't know, Sidi Bilal and I are very close. We're kind of like Talha and Zubair or Hassan and Hussein. And this time, actually, at this particular time, 5 years ago, we were actually in Senegal together, involved in sitting with Mashayikh and also speaking at a couple of conferences at this exact same time. So alhamdulillah, I haven't seen him since the COVID-19 pandemic, so it's very beautiful to also be connected back to my brother speaking again on a panel. Both of us have orientation and studies with Mashayikh from West Africa. This is both of our orientations. And with that, to begin the topic in which Sidi Bilal is going to elaborate on more in depth, in the next few moments, I want to elaborate on the foundation of this topic as it relates to the methodology of West African scholars of Tasawwuf, in particular, touching on comments from the life of one scholar who many Muslims outside of West African lineage don't know much about. And this is Sheikh Uthman Danfodio, also a Sheikh, Al-Alim, Rabbani, Al-Mujaddid, a Sheikh Uthman bin Fudi, Al-Maliki, Al-Qadiri, Qaddasallahu Sirr. And for those of you who haven't heard this name before, Sheikh Uthman bin Fudi, he lived around the late 18th century, early 19th century, in an area which would now be considered northern Nigeria. Of course, we know that there was no Nigeria back then until, I'll take a quick jab, until your country carved out these artificial borders that didn't exist in these lands. But he existed in this time, he lived in this time, and he established, with the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a governance that was based upon Iman, Islam, and Ihsan, that is commonly written about and known as the Sokoto Caliphate that he established. And he had children who were all ulama, women and men, including the renowned scholar and poet whose work still continue to this day in Nigeria, Nana Asma'u, and also the great scholar, his daughter known as Khadija, two great scholars, and his also renowned son who was his spiritual successor, Sheikh Muhammad bin Rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in. So Sheikh Osman bin Foudi, just to also let you know before I give some more words in regards to what I really want to say, just to give you some background. He wrote, just in Arabic language alone, over 150 unique works in the Arabic language. He was quadlingual, I believe is the proper word. He was from Fulani lineage, Fulani. He spoke Fulani, also Hausa. These are two predominant languages in northern Nigeria. He also spoke Arabic fluently. He was a master of Arabic language, both poetry and prose. And he also knew English. So this is his background. And he also, besides leading up this governmental system, or this affair in northern Nigeria, he was much more so inclined towards scholarship, in which he actually took a step back from governmental affairs, from politics, because politics really wasn't his thing. He was thrust into it and took this role for the common good and for the betterment of humankind. Not that he was seeking the kursi or seeking political authority as how it is most days these days, where people actually thirst and crave, even put their names forward for elections so that they can be voted into political authority. This actually was the opposite stance of Sheikh Osman bin Foudi. Now, what head of state would we know of today that would go and lead prayers and do a daily dars every day after Salat al-Asr? And not only that, he opened up and liberated learning for women folks, in which he would openly ask and invite the women folk to come to the masjid and to attend the daily durus, right? So he was a liberator. He also worked actively, my brothers and sisters, as what we could say, a Muslim abolitionist. And he was active in combating some of the Muslim chiefs, or so-called Muslim kings, who were actively involved in enslaving our ancestors, the fellow Muslims who were Africans, to sell them off to go be sent off to the Americas, the Caribbean, and other places to be in bondage, right? So he was a teacher, he was a scholar par excellence, but he was a liberator. He sought to liberate his people, and he sought to liberate the women folk from some people who sought to keep women in inferior status by trying to keep knowledge away from women. Because we know that knowledge is power. It's empowerment, right? Now, it is common in the West African tradition, and we're talking about the people of Tasawwuf, that the foundation of how the deen is understood is basically taught, or the starting place is from one foundational hadith. One foundational hadith. And this hadith comes in different wording, in different order, right? But we know this hadith is hadith Jibreel alayhi salam, right? And I'm sure that everyone in this room is familiar with the occasion in the latter part of the life of the Prophet alayhi salam in El Medina, and he was sitting with some of his companions. May Allah be well pleased with them. And we know that an individual or a person came wearing strikingly white clothing and came to the Prophet alayhi salam in front of the Sahaba, and there were 3 questions that were asked. And actually, on Metro Nabawi, there is a gate called Bab Jibreel. I've been fortunate to have access to walk through this gate. And when you walk through the door, it's literally the location where Jibreel alayhi salam had this interaction with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and also some of the Sahaba who were there, like Umar bin Khattab and Abu Huraira and others who were there and present at this gathering. The West African scholars tend to prefer and discuss this hadith from the narration of Imam al-Bukhari rahmatullah alayhi through Abu Huraira's chain of transmission. So in the other chain of transmission, the 3 questions are asked in one particular order. And both of these, by the way, have true meaning, but there's different implications of how these questions are asked. In the other riwayah, it is narrated that Jibril asked first, what is Islam? What is al-Islam? Then what is al-Iman? And then what is al-Ihsan? This is the order. In the narration of Abu Huraira, there's in Al-Bukhari, Iman is mentioned first, then Islam, then Ihsan. And there is a logic why the scholars, and Imam al-Ghazali, was also of this opinion and favored this hadith in this language as well, but this is where West Africans start, predominantly from this tradition. Al-Iman symbolizes, in this context, our aqidah or our creed, the very basics of what we must know to be properly inside the fold of Islam. So aqidah matters. We just can't make up our beliefs. And in this particular riwayah, it speaks about the belief in Allah, the belief in His malaika, this is a particular order, the belief in His books, the belief in the meeting with Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this doesn't mean just meeting Him in the day of resurrection, which Sidi Bilal is going to touch on more, inshallah. Belief in all of His rusul, all of His messengers, in which we know that all prophets were not messengers, but all messengers were prophets. So this is just an understanding that we have, that we can't say that there was a messenger after the prophet, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's Khatam al-Nabi'in, he's the seal of the prophets, which also means the seal of the messengers. And then also the belief in Yom al-Ba'ath, or belief in the day of resurrection. Then comes al-Islam. Al-Islam relates to the sacred law. It relates to that which governs our ibadah, and then we have that governs our actions. So aqidah matters and fiqh matters, right? These things matter. And then ihsan, of course, is the step that we have of worshiping Allah as if we can see Allah. But if you don't see Allah, then know that Allah sees you, right? And this is ihsan. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran, Inna Allah yuhibbul muhsinin. And surely Allah loves the people of ihsan, the people of spiritual beauty. Now, Sheikh Uthman bin Fudi, Qaddasallahu sirrah, he said in a couple of poetry, Wallah, la ya'budu bil uquli, bal deenuhu bi shar'ihil manquli. It's a very important line of poetry in this poem. He says, by Allah, we do not worship, or you do not worship, or you should not worship bil uqul. We don't worship by what we would say intellect, if we want to. We don't worship simply because of rationale. That's not why we worship. Bel, sometimes people translate it this as bel as no. No, bel more emphatically means of course not. Bel doesn't mean just no. It means of course not. Emphatically, of course not, exclamation point. Of course not. His deen, the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is based upon the transmitted law, or the transmitted way. Bishari al-manqul. Right? So, in regards to the methodology of teaching tasawwuf of Sheikh Uthman bin Fudi, as the great Sufi masters taught it, that there is no reaching haqiqah without sharia. That the sacred law matters. And we just don't come up with our own rulings independently. There is, as he mentions, there is dalil al-naqli, and then there's dalil al-aqli. And how we understand, firstly, our creed, how we understand the sacred law, and how we implement it in ibadah and mu'amalah, right? In our worship and in our actions, our social transactions, our financial transactions, is based upon that which is transmitted And al-manqul of transmission just does not mean text or picking up books independently. And this is important in how we are taught in our tradition that, and as Sheikh Usman bin Fudi, also being a spiritual guide, that we ourselves as Muslims, we don't do this do-it-yourself Islam. Or in America, we have you all have Burger King here? Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, my ignorance. There used to be a popular commercial for Burger King, they say, have it your way. Right? Have it your way. We just don't pick up the books and think that we're going to have a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and reach the state of ihsan just doing it our own way. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us this in the Quran, as the Shaykh elaborates on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just didn't drop a book from the sky and say, oh Arabs, read this Quran for yourself, even though they were fluent in Arabic language. Right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a man to them who was a teacher, who not only taught the meaning through word, but also through embodiment. So he, Azza wa Jal, says this and mentions in the Quran, هُوَ الَّذِي بَعَثَ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَإِن كَانُوا مِن قَبْلُ لَفِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. So that surely he, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we know that who is one of Allah's names. Who is one of Allah's names. He sent his messenger from amongst the unlettered people to recite to them the signs and to purify them, then to teach them the book and the wisdom. And most certainly before they were a clear, manifest error. Right? Teachers. And this is also of the wisdom of Surah Al-Kahf, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the story of Musa alayhi salam. Musa alayhi salam is one of Ulul Azm al-Rusul. He's one of the steadfast messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we are told in Surah Al-Kahf that Allah Azza wa Jal to be his spiritual guide. We know him as Al-Khidr alayhi salam, though his name is not mentioned in the Quran, but we are told by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is the name of this Murshid, Al-Murshid Kamil, this perfect guide, is Al-Khidr alayhi salam, literally meaning the green one. Literally the green one. By the way, as a side note, if you ever read old Arabic literature or old Arabic poetry, and it refers to a man as a Rajul al-Akhdar, or a man who is green, this means a man who is intensely black in skin color. Al-Akhdar, when it refers to a human being, Al-Akhdar, green, it means he had dark black like someone from South Sudan. Right? And there were Arabs of this skin color, by the way, but that's for a different discussion. The original Arabs. So, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we extract this, brought a man this earth that was ma'soom, that was guarded from the intention of disobeying Allah, and he was commissioned with a divine book. And before he went to Fir'aun, he had a spiritual guide or mentor for tarbiyah. Since a great prophet of Allah and other prophets also had teachers, and Jibreel alayhi salam, of course, was the teacher of the prophets. Since a prophet had a spiritual guide who was ma'soom, we aren't ma'soom or ma'sooma, isn't that right? It would be delusional for us that we are going to be in the presence of Allah. Well, for us to be in our hearts in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's always present. We're only veiled from his presence. He's always present. If we think that we can get to the station of ihsan on our own without a guide, this is the height of self-delusion. Right? And this is what the teachings of Sheikh Uthman bin Fudi, when he's talking about al-manqul, that we should not only connect ourselves to tradition, but we also connect ourselves to people of the tradition who teach us and bring us up or raise us up through tarbiyah to help us along in our spiritual wayfaring, right? So this is more than just being connected to text, but it's connected to those people who learn from men and women, who learn from men and women, who learn from men and women, in an unbroken chain going back to the teacher of this ummah and to the mercy of mankind, Al-Habib Al-Mustafa salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. So I need to stop right there so Sidi Bilal can continue, but this is the way that Sheikh Uthman bin Fudi taught, and this is the order in regards to the raising up and the emphasis of Islam related to Hadith Jibreel. Iman is mentioned first because we have to have proper creed and the proper understanding of our deen. Then fiqh. Fiqh is, Islam represents fiqh. And then ihsan is our tasawwuf. And with that, I will stop by from
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair. Imam Dawud, that was beautiful. Alhamdulillah. There's so much there that you unpacked. I know we're going to go straight on to Dr. Bilal Ware because we want to give him time to make sure we fit it in, and we will have a break. The plan is to have a break to pray Maghrib, and then we come back for questions and answers. So if you do have questions, you can write them down. We'll come back to have the questions then. So straight away, I don't want to waste any time. So Dr. Rudolf Bilal Ware is a historian of Africa and Islam. He earned his PhD in history in 2004 from the University of Pennsylvania, where he was trained in African history, African American history, and Islamic intellectual history. He is currently an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the founder and director of the Initiative for the Study of Race, Religion, and Revolution. His first book, The Walking Quran, which is a great book actually, you should get that book, alhamdulillah. Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge, and the History in West Africa explores the history of 1,000 years of the Quran, schooling in the region. He is the author of multiple articles on Muslim anti-slavery movement in Africa and the Atlantic world, and his most recent book, Jihad of the Pen, explores Sufi thought in West Africa. Without further ado, I'll give you Dr. Bilal.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala barakatuhu. Again, very lukewarm. You need more energy than that. Just as a matter of Sharia, just to be reminded, I'm not actually required to greet you, but if I greet you, you are required to return it. So can we do a little bit better? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. It's an honor, privilege, and pleasure to be gathered with you, especially in the presence of my brother from another mother, Imam Dawud Walid, who was very accommodating in shortening his comments to try to leave more space for me. I, in turn, will try to keep my comments as succinct as possible in order to make time for questions for both of us. Seeing God. That was what was on the flyer, right? So that's what y'all came to talk about, the vision of Allah Most High. And Imam Dawud Walid set the table for us nicely with reminding us of the prophetic definition of the substance of the religion. The religion is not complete when one fulfills its 5 pillars that are mentioned in the definition of Islam. Okay? It's not complete when we have fulfilled those 5 pillars. Nor is it complete even when we have an intellectual understanding of those 6 articles of faith which are mentioned in the definition of Iman. Rather, our faith is only fulfilled and perfected when the last of those stations, Maqamatul Ihsan, is realized. And when the Prophet ﷺ was asked to define for all eternity, because he ﷺ knows exactly who's doing the asking in that moment, while no one else does. Reflect carefully on the hadith of Jibril. The Prophet ﷺ knows just who he's talking to. No one else knows. This is a secret between the two of them, between the master and the disciple. They are staging a teachable moment for us, for all of eternity. Jibril comes and sits knee to knee with the Prophet ﷺ, upon whose thighs he places the palms of his hand. And Sayyidina Umar, may Allah be well pleased with him, who is responsible for the narration that most of us read, which goes Islam, Iman, Ihsan. You know that Umar was ready to cut this man to ribbons if he ever made a false move in that proximity to the Messenger of God. Then he quizzes him like you would quiz a school child. And Umar in his narration says, and we were astonished that after first questioning him, that he would then confirm him. In other words, who are you to say to Muhammad ﷺ that you have answered well when he asks you about Islam, Iman, Ihsan? The point in the whole of the story is that the master and the disciple have come together to provide us the model of what appropriate relationships between masters and disciples are. Even though the spiritual station of the disciple in this instance exceeds that of the master, his adab is humility. Because anyone that teaches you so much as a letter of the Quran is your master. So he, alayhi salatu wasalam, is providing a foundational definition of the contents of the deen with his teacher for all time for us. And he can't leave ihsan out. Now what is ihsan? It is worshiping Allah as though you see him, and knowing that if you do not see him, that he sees you. I asked the Sheikh in the Muradiyah about this. I said, this is like having a 24-hour surveillance camera on this station of worship. He said, no. No. He said, that's the test of Islam, not the test of Ihsan. A 24-hour surveillance camera upon you is only going to watch your deeds. He said, the test of Ihsan is to put a 24-hour surveillance camera on your heart, on your intentions. Do you perform any actions for other than Allah? That's worshiping God as though you see him. But notice that the hadith does not say, since you can't see him, does it? No. If you don't see him, worship him as though you do until you do. So the question that I will give you, can God be seen? Of course God can be seen. In a narration that Imam Dawud shared with me last night from Jafar as-Sadiq, he was asked, can God be seen? He said, I would not worship a God that I cannot see. In the Wolof language of Senegal, which is where I did my PhD research, which is where I sat with most of my teachers, they say, "But moydam," which means seeing is believing. So how do we arrive at this station? And what is the vision of God, properly speaking? When the poetry of Shaykh al-Islam Ibrahim Yas, who's the author of no less than 99 different texts in the Arabic language, who was in many ways the greatest living Islamic figure of the mid-20th century. Shaykh al-Islam brought literally tens of millions of people into the Tijani Sufi way during his lifetime. When his poetry is recited and sung, oftentimes, it is punctuated with a refrain. So the Arabic poetry of Shaykh Ibrahim will be sung, and then people will sing the chorus. Soko hammo noko jammo la ilaha illallah, which means, if you don't know him, how can you worship him? If you do not know him, how can you worship him? Ahmed Tijan Sharif, the spiritual mentor of Shaykh al-Islam Ibrahim Yas, said of the science of Sufism, is that the one that does not immerse themselves in this science of ours risks dying in a state of unbelief and being unaware of it. Why? Because we will, instead of worshiping the real, true, and living God, the one who describes himself by those beautiful names read by our Qadi tonight, we will worship instead a construct of our intellect, a construct of our imagination, a construct of the theologians. The great Nubian mystic of the 9th century CE, Dhunnun al-Misri, said, "Know that whatever your imagination or intellect can conceive, that God is not that." So the simple study of either the religious sciences of theology contained under Iman, or the religious sciences of law and jurisprudence within the purview of Islam will not and cannot lead a person to the fulfillment of Islam. It is not sufficient. Rather, one must cultivate this last and final step, which is culminated in states of witnessing. Without witnessing the experiential unveilings of the divine essence, how will you even know that it was God that you were worshiping this whole time? I asked y'all the question. No, I'm serious. How will you know? So the ultimate and foundational quest that must drive human existence, and certainly must drive any pursuit of knowledge in the religion, is first knowing God. And this is the reason for the preference of all of the West African scholars, whether it's Uthman Danfodio, whose works are under translation in Jihad of the Pen, our book that Sidi Rakim just mentioned, or Elijah Umar Futi Utal, the great Tijani Sheikh of the 19th century, also under translation in a volume. Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, whose works I translated in that particular volume. Sheikh al-Islam Ibrahim Yas, translated by my first PhD student and dear friend, Dr. Zachary Wright, also under translation in that volume. They all preferred this order: Iman, Islam, Ihsan. And the reason for this is simple. If you don't know him, how can you serve him? Is any obedience at the level of the limbs without its orientation towards the divine essence, will it be accepted anyway? Of course not. Because acts of worship that are performed for other than Allah will be rewarded with other than Allah. So unless the act is first oriented, then there can be no meaning in the worship of the limbs. It simply becomes physical movements devoid of meaning. Obedience, perhaps, but is it written for you? Is it accepted of you? Are we understanding the stakes of pursuing knowledge of God? In Shaykh al-Islam's tafsir of Quran, and again this is a reference to Shaykh Ibrahim Yas, he says of the famous Hadith Qudsi that we all know, I was a hidden treasure, so I created the world that I might be known. Shaykh Ibrahim elaborates, and he said what is meant by known in this context is loved. That God was a hidden treasure, so he created the world, or more properly, us as sentient beings, that he might be loved. Notice that in the Quran, at no point does the expression Allah yuhib, God loves, occur, except that the direct object of the verb to love is a human being. If God loves something else in his creation, he ain't see fit to say so in his book. So ultimately, the stakes in pursuing knowledge of God is to allow us to manifest that love of the divine, and to have that love reciprocated upon us through the fulfillment of those noble and excellent traits of character that were embodied in the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, and which were praised by the Quran itself. The Quran says that God loves the tawabin, God loves the mutatahhirin, God loves the people of Tawbah, Tahara, Taqwa, Ihsan, Sabr, Qist, Tawakkul. 7 beautiful traits of character that if we begin to embody them and orient them towards the divinity, then God will write his love for us. Enter our names into a book that is kept in the company of the high. But in order to get to this station, we must first know God. Because how can you love someone that you don't know? How can you worship someone that you don't know? Fortunately, we've been given a roadmap and a vessel. The Prophet ﷺ in Hadith Qudsi, and the way to understand Hadith Qudsi in contradistinction both to Quran, which is God's verbatim speech, and Hadith, which is the Prophet ﷺ's speech, is Hadith Qudsi is what's perhaps best understood as a divine paraphrase. It's an inspiration that God has put upon the heart of the Prophet ﷺ that he then chooses how to express it with his blessed tongue. Peace be upon him. So we mentioned one. I was a hidden treasure. I created the world that I might be known. But we'll mention another. Neither my heavens nor my earth contain me, but I'm contained in the heart of my believing servant. We've been given a vessel that is capable of witnessing these divine manifestations, and that vessel is the human heart. When Moses, let's talk about the vision of God, asks to see God with his eyes in Surah Al-A'raf, he says, show yourself to me that I might gaze upon you. What does God say to him in that moment? He says, you will not see me, but gaze upon the mountain. If it stays in place, then you will see me. Then God manifested himself to the mountain, and the mountain crumbled, and Moses fainted, blacked out, lost his consciousness. Why? Because nothing in our physical composition is going to allow us to witness. La tudrikul absar, the eyes do not see him, but rather he encompasses the eyes. We will never gaze upon Allah with these physical eyes. Even the slightest manifestation of the divine essence would burn these eyes away. But we are told that we have a heart that is within our chest that is capable of witnessing and gazing upon the divine. So the cultivation of hearts that are capable of bearing this secret, that ultimately is the affair. And that is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ was referencing when he said, worship God as though you see him, and if you do not see him, nobody sees you. The Quran likens divine manifestations to the crumbling of mountains in another place. Right? Had we sent this Quran down upon a mountain, indeed you would have seen it fall, rent asunder by fear of God. But the Quran wasn't sent down upon a mountain. This Quran was sent down upon a human heart, and a human heart was capable of containing.
Sallu ala Nabi.
So our aspiration and our goal in fulfilling the guidance of our teacher, alayhi salatu wassalam, is to cultivate as much of that excellence of character and purity of heart as we can, so that we too can become sites of instantiation of divine manifestation, that we can become apt vessels, that God would reveal something of his own divine essence to us according to our own capacities to withstand it. In a book that hasn't come out yet, that is called Visionaries, Second Sight and Social Change in Islamic West Africa, there's a chapter in it that's about seeing God, where I've collected many of the stories of the different awliya and great teachers in the religion, both in West Africa and outside of it, that have talked about this. Among them, Ahmed ibn Hanbal. Okay? The eponym of the Hanbali school of jurisprudence he counted dozens of times that he had witnessed Allah Ta'ala's direct manifestation in dreams. If you think that this is just some kind of goofy Sufi talk, understand that it is precisely not that. Without attaining this station and level, you will live in a state of doubt and uncertainty throughout the entirety of your life as to whether you have been worshiping a figment of your own imagination or a construct of your own intellect. Until the Lord of the throne himself makes himself manifest to you. How do you know that it's not just an analytical construct that you've been worshiping? Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, Emir Abdul Qadir, who led Algerian resistance against French occupation when he was 20 years old, and had been turbaned as the greatest living spiritual inheritor of Ibn Arabi a year before that, when he was 19, said that the God that reconciles transcendent majesty with immanent beauty is the God that the messengers commanded us to know. But reason can know the existence of no such God. Reason can only know a God that's distant, not one that's immanent. Our intellectual constructs through theology and through jurisprudence have been moving the divine essence further and further away from us, to the point that there are people who will ask you, where's God? And if you don't say that he's established on the throne, they'll pronounce you as deficient in your belief. But the knowers of God know that in Surah Al-Hadid, God describes himself as established upon the throne. وَمَعْكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ, in the same ayah of the Quran. His transcendent majesty, represented by that throne, does not breach his permanent immanence, closer to you than your own jugular vein. Your jugular vein is inside you. It doesn't get any closer than that. The essence, doesn't get any closer than that. If God is already present inside you, if your heart is this vessel capable of witnessing, if he's closer to you than your own jugular vein, if he crafted your physical form out of the earth with a touch, because notice in Surah Al-Sad, God says to Iblis, why did you not bow to that which I made with my own two hands? Everything else in creation is made with speech. When God wants to decree a matter, he has to say to it be, and it is. Everything else is created with this exteriorizing act. Not us. No. The human being is made with a caress, and then what happens? Animated with a kiss. And when I have fashioned him and breathed into him of my own ruh, and fall down before him prostrate. Two separate ayahs of the Quran with the exact same wording. The intimacy, the presence of the divine breath inside the breast of the human being is one of the most consistent refrains that the Quran has to offer to us. So then how do we go about, as Imam Dawud put it, removing the veil? Because indeed Allah is present already. Indeed Allah is present already. It is that our own anfus, our own nafs, our own soul stands as the obstacle within us that keeps us from the divine witnessing. And that's the reason why each one of us needs a guide. Because, as they say in East Africa, even the sharpest knife can't carve its own handle. If the instrument that is broken, that is the obstacle between you and divine witnessing, is you, how can you use a broken instrument to repair itself? It's nonsensical. So the entire contents of New Age spirituality that seek to pursue spiritual elevation is confining humanity to the prisons of their own anfus. The entirety of it. Understand that the beginning and ends of its discourses unfold entirely within the nafs. But the Quran tells us that the principal parts of the human being, yes, this nafs, which must be purified and can move from this station where it is commanding towards evil as it is in Surah Yusuf to the point where it is a soul that is pleased with God and then pleasing to God. It can get on a journey. It's in a terrible state where it starts, but it can get there. It can be purified. And as the Prophet ﷺ and all of the messengers, that was their job, was to purify the souls. This nafs, this physical body, this shell of flesh, this heart that was mentioned, and then that divinely infused, inspired spirit, these are the principal parts of us. As long as the nafs is running roughshod within us, the vision of the divine is impossible. It's too close for us to see. Shaykh Ibn Iyas, to return to the definition of the divine, said, he said that the confirming tawheed, a proper pronunciation of the oneness of God, is to understand first and foremost that God is present with every single created thing, without hulul and without ittihad, without indwelling and without fusion. That the beginning of the awakening of the heart to the vision of the divine comes with the realization that in nothing that you encounter is Allah absent. Nothing. Nothing. You see me as a breathing, walking, talking lump of flesh in front of you, but that's what your eyes witness. That is not what is present. There is a narration. I was about to mention the Prophet's name, so I instinctively slid my shoes off. So Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was narrating to some new Bedouin believers the basic principles of Tawheed. And Sayyidina Ali, may Allah be pleased with him and know his face, was sitting alongside him. And the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said that in the beginning there was only God, and in the end there will only be God. And they were nodding, and Sayyidina Ali offered a word in, and he said, and even now there's only God. And the Prophet ﷺ confirmed this. The truth is that if you think that God created this creation, cast it into motion, created all of its proximate causes, and then allowed the thing to unfold according to its own logic, then you don't believe in God. Or at the very least, you believe in him but have no idea who he is. God is present in the creation of every single moment, every single breath. Nothing in him becomes absent. Because were he to become absent, then the creation itself would fall apart. It would end. Our Qadi read these ayahs that give us some of God's most beautiful names. Some of God's most beautiful names. And one of the Saudi muftis once questioned Shaykh Ibrahim Iyas on these divine attributes. I'll tell this story to get us a little further into the topic. He said, how do you understand, this is a Wahhabi mufti now, so you guys can sort of picture it. He said, how do you understand this witness that the Quran mentioned, this ma'iyah? Remember I just mentioned it. He's with you wherever you are. The Saudi Mufti said, as for us, we believe that God is present in his knowledge, but not in his essential being. In other words, it's as though his name, Al-Alim, is present, but not his that. Okay? That the attribute is present, but not the actual essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a big statement that he's made. So Shaykh Ibrahim's response was to say to him, he said, if the attribute is separated from that to which it is attributed, both the attribute and the attributed become deficient. In other words, there is no separating Allah Ta'ala from any of his attributes. You can't suggest that one would be present in a particular place and time, and that the essence itself would not be there. Indeed, the essence is there and is present, closer to you than your own jugular vein. You see me as a lump of flesh, I see Allah. Every last one of you playing out a role that has been ceded to you in this temporal creation. But what you are for me is a series of divine manifestations. Because every single individual human life is God's performance of his identity for each individual servant. Everything that you have encountered from the beginning of your birth, and indeed from a day before time until a day after time, is God's self-expression and self-disclosure to you. Did it come from somewhere else other than Allah? The beginning of this level of divine unveiling is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ mentioned. Worshiping God as though you see him. Beginning to understand that nothing you encounter in your life is in fact other than Allah. Were it to be other than Allah, what would it be? In the Wolof language, the Talibés, the students in the Muridiyya Tariqa founded by Shaykh Abdul Bamba, are fond of saying, Yalla Kendala, which means that God is one. That part's easy for us to accept. They say, Yalla Kendala te lugu yalla nenala, which means that which is not God does not exist at all. Not only is the human being a general sight of this performance of divinity, but it is a specific and favored sight of the performance of this divinity. God doesn't say that he loves anything else. Nor does he even say of the physical creation of anything else. Remember, the Quran tells us that the human being is made in the best of images. Correct? Best of forms. But in authentic narrations, the Prophet ﷺ said that God said, another one of these inspired speeches, Hadith Qudsi, that God made Adam in his own image. Even your lowly physical fleshly form is a physical mirror of the metaphysical essence of the creator of the heavens and the earth. Has he not favored you, child of Adam? The entirety of the sequence of revelation, beginning with Adam and ending with the messenger of God, alayhi salatu wassalam, those 124,000 prophets, those 313 messengers, those 5 messengers of resolve, all of that is a call to you here and now. To uncover and unveil the cloak that is over your seeing, the cloak that is over your hearing, and inherit a birthright that God has breathed into your very breast. The Prophet ﷺ, in another narration, said that the inhabitants of paradise will be enjoying all of the delights of the garden. And then God will speak to them. The wajh, the face of God, will speak to the inhabitants of the paradise. All of the paradise. And will say to them, are you not well pleased? And they will say, how could we be other than well pleased when we are enjoying the like of that which no hand I had ever seen and no hand had ever touched? And then God will say to them, shall I give you better than that? And they will say, what can be better than that? He will say, and God says, I shall let down upon you my Ridwan. God's good pleasure understood by most people in this room to probably refer to an abstract pleasure, that God is happy with you. But Ridwan is not just an abstract concept because, one, God doesn't make abstractions, God makes entities. Human beings make abstractions because our imaginations are incapable of perceiving the entities. So we create abstractions, God creates things. That's one. Ridwan is not an abstraction. Ridwan was defined by the 17th century Moroccan Sufi Abdulaziz al-Dabakh, whose works are cited by Sheikh al-Islam Ibrahim Yas, El-Ajumar al-Fututal, and many of the other West African scholars. Ridwan is understood to be a paradise, a level of paradise that's beyond the physical structures of the gardens, beyond Jannatul Firdaus, a place where the face of God itself is never absent from the servant. The face of God appears in all of those other paradises, intermittently, episodically, just the way that it was narrated. But with Ridwan, one is never parted from the face. 24-hour surveillance camera upon your actions, or 24-hour surveillance camera upon your heart. Why is it that you do what you do? Do you fulfill the requirements of that Sharia because you want God's garden? Because I don't. With God as my witness. If He gives it to me, He doesn't give it to me. It's the same. What I want is Him. What I want is to never be parted from the beloved. Not even for an instant. Rabi al-Adawiyya, whose teachings were brought back to life in the 19th century by Nana Asma'u in northern Nigeria, the daughter of Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, but who's the living exemplar of piety for male and female alike. We all know in the famous story where she was seen walking through the streets of Basra with a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. They said, "Oh, lady of the next world, what's the meaning of this?" She said, "I want to light a fire in the garden and burn it down. I want to take this bucket of water and extinguish the hellfire so that these two veils will be removed. And only those will remain that seek God out of love for Him, not out of fear of punishment or desire for reward." What Sheikh Ibrahim Yas used to say as his most powerful supplication was, "May Allah give us Allah." Does God have a garden to offer that is better than His essence? That garden is created. It was made. It comes into being. God is eternal from before time. No beginning to Him. Eternal after time. No end to Him. Surely His paradise cannot compete with Him. I walked one day a number of years ago in the Chazali Zawiya in Avignon, France, which if you get a chance to go to it, don't miss the opportunity. A group of 9 French Sufi families, all of them, kind of original French families, converts, pooled their resources and bought the castle of a 19th century French philosopher. And it's a real place. I'm not making any of this up. In it, they keep bees and have gardens and have sessions of dhikr. You mentioned the name Hu as one of those divine names. One of the most beautiful things of the Shazali Adkar is the slow inspiration, deepest breathing possible, and then breathe out the word Hu as long and slow as you can. And I was asked by one of the seekers if I understood the meaning of this, and I said, I think so. It's returning that divine breath back to the one who breathed it. So why am I mentioning this story now? Believe it or not, there's a point. It's to get back to a desire beyond the garden and a fear other than the fear of the torments of the fire. So I was at the Shazali Zawi, and I met an astonishing human being. His name was Ibrahim. He was one of the seekers. He had come from Rome for this particular weekend gathering. He was an extraordinary person. He had converted to Islam while he was studying to be a priest at the Vatican. Extraordinary human being. That's when he made his shahada. It was about 9 years before we met, in the interest of time, I'll make sure that tells the story. So this brother and I became very, very close, even though we only spent one day together. In Senegal, it's not unusual and in no way strange for two men that are related and or closely to know one another to hold hands while they're walking. No suspicion is entailed in it. And Ibrahim and I were holding hands walking all day. He's my size, 6'3", big guy. But he barely spoke any English. He didn't speak French, and so which is what I used to speak to most of the people there. But we nonetheless understood each other perfectly throughout the day and talked about everything as though we had known each other forever. When the day was coming to a close, he told me a story that his sheikh had told him, and I'll end this discourse in this way. He said, if you have this feeling, Bilal, that we've known each other forever, he said, know that it's because we know each other from the day of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the day of Am I Not Your Lord, when all the spirits are gathered together. We know, it was actually Imam Dawud that first reminded me of the hadith of the Prophet said, it's like legionnaires in the army, the spirits are like legionnaires. They come to know one another in this world on the basis of their previous associations. He said to me, he said, we all know the story of the day of Am I Not Your Lord, where God asks all the spirits, is he not indeed the Lord? And we know that the Prophet responded with his bala, indeed, you are the Lord, before any other created being could speak. I once sat with Sheikh Tijani Sise, sorry for the friend of Rakim Sheikh. I once sat with Imam Sheikh Tijani Sise in Qatar, and we were talking about this, and he said, yes, Bilal, but he said, but never forget that everything that you understand as creation was made from the Beth and that Bala. So the Prophet ﷺ was the first one to speak on that day, affirming God's rububiyyah, his lordship, nurturing lordship over us before any other being could do it. As soon as God stopped talking, because he's not impolite, and before any other human spirit could respond, he said, Bala. He said, we all know that part of the story. He said, but my sheikh told me another part of the story. So with your permission, I'll finish this. He said, the wahj, the face of Allah wa ta'ala, is what everyone is gazing upon on the day of Allah. There isn't anything else that's present, and God has just asked us a direct question. So we are all fixed upon that face. I could see Ibrahim searching for the words. He said, then God made the dunya. He said, and a group of the people that were looking at his blessed face, Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, looked away to look at the dunya. And I saw him searching for the words, and I said, that was the first cut. He said, yes. That was the first cut. He said, then he created the garden. And people could hear the singing of birds and the flowing of the streams. So amongst those who still had their faces fixed upon the face of God Most High, a portion of them looked away from the face of God Most High to look upon the paradise that he created. I said, that was the second cut. He said, yeah. He said, then God created the hellfire. He said, and the sounds and the heat and the crackling of stones was so fearsome and intimidating that amongst the people that still had their faces fixed upon Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, looked away just to see what that god-awful noise was. I said, that was the last cut. He said, yes. He said, what God said, as for the ones who keep their faces fixed upon mine, they are mine. and I will distribute them amongst the tribes, amongst the nations, amongst the families, but they will come to know themselves, one another, on the way that they responded on this day. If we have decided, in spite of the risk of the Omicron variant, if we have decided, this is the first trip that I've made since everything went on lockdown. I didn't know if I could still speak in front of people or only on Zoom. You guys will be judging that. But if we're willing to leave our homes, if we're willing to gather in this place to discuss the vision of the divine, then it is very likely an expression of the fact that we kept our faces turned towards His on that day. My call to you today is to inherit your birthright. Don't wait until we're born to see the lights of God. The Lord of the throne can be seen for the heart that is prepared for that manifestation. And there is a deep risk if we do not take this, which is that, and this is also from authentic hadith. I first encountered it in the teachings of Sayyid Sanbai, one of the great teachers in the Muhammadiyya tariqah. But it's based on authentic narrations that on the day of judgment, God Most High will appear to the people in a form that only the Arafin recognize. But only the knowers will recognize this form. When He appears in this form, only those that have already seen Him will know Him. As for those who don't, when He announces who He is, they'll say, no, you're not God. I'm going to wait right here until God comes. And then God will eventually manifest in a form that everyone will recognize. Those people, if they had Iman, will still be entered into the garden. But I do not want to be at any point in my creation one that denies God. I don't want to be one who is questioned on that day by Him and denies Him because I prefer constructing my own intellect instead. Die before you die. And let the undying essence manifest itself upon your heart according to your capacity of vision. And in the meantime, the best way to pursue that is to sit with the people who have had these experiences. These are experiences that cannot be gotten through books. You can't get it through Sheikh Google. You can't get it through study of Sharia. You can't get it through study of Iman. The currency of this knowledge is tasting and experience. I'll end with this. There was a seeker who had seen God and went to the town of the great mystic Abu Yazid Bistami. And he was told to go make ziyarah to this great sheikh. And he said, what do I need to go see the sheikh for when I've already seen God? And he was told it would be better for you to see Abu Yazid Bistami one time than for you to see God 70 times. And the reason for that is that the manifestation is in accordance with the inner condition of the aspirant. Sit with the people who are of elevated spiritual knowledge. Just being with them brings you closer to the divine presence. It helps raise your station, makes your heart more capacious so that you are capable of seeing more and more with greater and greater clarity. Less of the darkness of your own unfocus intervening to cloud and distort that which God would show to you. If anything was of benefit, it's from God. All that was deficient is strictly from me, and perhaps also from the fact that I'm out of practice. A couple of years of not speaking in front of live crowds. But I think that takes us up to so I want to
Jazakallah khair. Wow, this was real food for thought. I can see everybody looks full.
Are you guys okay?
They're deep in contemplation. Wow. I mean, subhanallah. There's so much there, so much to unpack. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. And as Dr. Bilal Ware said, yes, so when we've come up at the time of Maghrib, inshallah, we have the prayer room, which is at the end. I hope that, you think we all fit in there?
No. I think we've got 10 minutes.
We're gonna, inshallah.
I think.
Okay. I think we can do.
I have a question. You're talking on a spiritual guide. What should you look for in a person to trust in your team and your America?
Did you hear that question?
It was a question about spiritual guide and what do you look for so that you can trust this kind of person? Imam, would you like to?
Oh, yeah.
So, in Kashf al-Bas, the lifting of the veil, the removal of confusion by Shaykh Ibn Nas, he first goes on to describe all of the kinds of knowledge that would be necessary in a consummate shaykh, a consummate guide. Okay? So you can find a very, very good listing there, and I'll send you a reference. But I'm not deflecting the question. I'm just giving the answer. He then goes on to describe all of the dangers that come with the charlatans and fraudulent sheikhs that pretend to have this kind of knowledge and don't have it. And these have multiplied in great abundance. Almost everyone in this room will have been burned in one way or another by such a person. Okay. So what Shaykh Ibn says after describing these consummate traits and warning against the frauds, he said, you may be wondering where you will ever find such a person. He says, surely they must be rarer than an anqa, which I think is probably a phoenix. That would be the translation for anqa, or maybe a griffin, but I think it's a phoenix. He said, so surely such a person would be rarer than a phoenix. But then he says, but the truth is that you do not need to know where you'll find such a person. He said, as soon as you need to find your guide, the way that a man who is dying of thirst in the desert needs to find water, the way that a woman that has lost her child in the desert needs to find her child, then your guide will appear to you. So one of the things that I counsel people, and especially women, is to be wary, to be very careful, because there are many people engaged in spiritual abuse and sexual abuse in this community. Be wary of them. Sit with people for lengthy periods of time before you allow them into your circle of trust. But when you feel, and just because someone is a real sheikh doesn't mean they're your sheikh. Right? If your spirits are not connected, then that person can be authentic and elevated, but not be the guy for you. But when you find that person who your heart, your body, and your spirit feel safe, but your nafs feels uneasy, that's the one. That's the one for you. If anybody that makes your spirit, body, or heart feel unsafe is not for you. If your nafs feels safe, you should keep looking. Because your nafs is going to need to be broken down. Your nafs should be worried. When you encounter your actual guide, and they can be male or female. The scholars of West Africa are almost, and this is something Imam Dawud and I have discussed regularly, are of the almost unanimous opinion that the first of the axial saints, the first Qutb is Fatima. That there, and because so therefore there is no spiritual station that is open to a man that is close to a woman in this current age. When Sheikh Maryam Anyas, the daughter of Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Anyas, passed away, Sheikh Mahi Sise in his eulogy said that no person on earth has surpassed her during the past century, except perhaps her father. And he didn't say in knowledge of Quran, no, he said period. So there is no station that is open to a man that's close to a woman. So my guy might have been a woman, yours may be a man. These things are irrelevant. But sit with that person who you feel safe with in those three parts of yourself, and uneasy within the rest of yourself.
I have one thing to add on. I agree with what Sayyid Bilal said. I would also say until that guy manifests himself or herself in front of you, that you make As-Salat al-Nabi your guide.
Allahu Akbar.
As-Salat al-Nabi is your guide, and it's been passed down through us, and this is something that is known throughout the Torah, but you start off and do at least 1,000 As-Salat al-Nabi per day, and whatever formula you use, you know for sure that Salat al-Ibrahimiyya is a good formula because we all say it 5 times a day in our prayer minimum. So 1,000 times, and inshallah, that's a practice that's been recommended for us until your guide is presented.
Excellent.
Okay, is there another question there? And we have also, okay, we've got a mic now, a roving mic, mashallah.
Okay, I can work without it. Thank you for such an enlightening and refreshing talk, and thank you to my colleague Haj Khalid for dragging me here from Norwich in the UK. Just going back to the Hadith City, Imam Dawud you mentioned, and that's the first I heard that people say it the other way around with Islam and Islam. I didn't know that, so thank you for that. But also, is there a reference in the West African tradition to that last part about tell me about the hour, the last day? Like, I know some people say that eschatology is part of, should be raised up because of that. Is there any tradition in the West African, any in the West African?
For the sake of time, I will say yes. That's part of eschatology, and the signs of the hour is mentioned in the hadith, and the teachers do talk about it. And in one particular part, outside of me talking about this, I make one reference to one particular point all the time, that one of the signs of the end of time, or the hour, is that it mentions that there will be 50 imra'ah, that there will be 50 women for every one upright male. But it doesn't say literally 50 females for every one male. This is how we get twisted sometimes, right? That the qayyim, the rajul al-qayyim is a specific type of real man, a particular type of man with particular characteristics. So the hadith shouldn't be understood. We shouldn't look at that hadith, by the way, that it simply means numerically 50 females for every one male. It's a particular type of man, if you all follow what I'm saying.
And for deeper understanding on that point, you should check out tomorrow's presentation. Where are we going to be tomorrow? Creative Foundation.
Creative Foundation.
Imam Dawud is presenting his book called Futur on the Sacred Masculinity in the Islamic tradition.
It just came out, as a matter of fact. I just got my copy.
Just the first copy. I got mine signed as well.
The official book launches tomorrow, but we literally are talking about the tarbiyah and the character points, or the traits of character, and that upraising to raise a dhakar into a real rajul, a real man.
The only thing that I would add, just in the interest of time, you know, as a historian of Islam in West Africa, one of the things that's always been striking to me is that Sheikh Usman Danfodio, you know, whose activities are at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, was absolutely convinced that he was going to see Imam Mahdi, that he was sure that he was living in the end of days. Elijah Mahfouz Tal, who lives about a half century later, is sure of the same thing. Sheikh Ahmed Bamba is absolutely convinced of the exact same. And they're not wrong. The hour, think about Surah Taha, when the hour is right on top of Sayyidina Musa, and God says the hour approaches, I almost conceal it so that each soul can be judged according to that for which it strives. The hour is right on top of Moses. Moses is living 2,000 years before the messenger of God, right? It's right on top of Moses. It's right on top of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The truth is it's right on top of us. It's right on top of us. And all of the people of Dhikr and Salawat have prepared in their time to be part of the army of Imam Mahdi, which will win a jihad of light against its enemies. And the way that I say this, you know, just because, you know, why I am is that if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready. So my approach to everything is to try to make sure that I'm drilling, so that if I'm called upon to do my part in that time, then I'm going to be ready for it. Because a lot of people that think that they have faith, when they see the Masih al-Dajjal, when they see a false Messiah bending the rules of what looks like reality to them, the weakness and the fear in their hearts will cause them to ally themselves with the forces of darkness. The forces of light will be standing right in front of them, but they won't recognize it. You have to witness with a manifest witnessing if you're going to understand how the unfolding of the end of things is actually going to happen. Sitting around studying the signs and reading about them in books is much less important than preparing your heart for the fitna. And and it is a fitna, because the shaitan is described repeatedly by the Quran as da'if, as weak. But the Prophet ﷺ never described the Dajjal as weak. He said that the Dajjal is the greatest fitna. So you really have to take this seriously and prepare.
The subject, but it is related to West Africa. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade, from my understanding, a significant portion of West Africa was Islamic. What I want to know, what portion or what percentage of those that were enslaved were taken to the West, and did any of the scholars in West Africa write about that particular time and what was happening?
So I'll begin to answer with this one. So the best historian's estimates that I would usually offer is that between 10 and 15% of the 13 to 20 million, that's the best estimates that we have on the number of enslaved that were brought out of Africa and sold in the transatlantic slave trade, that between 10 and 15% of that population was Muslim. That's my best conservative historian's estimate. God knows that's the number. That sounds like a small number until you realize that that would make Muslims the largest single contingent in the Atlantic slave trade. Large, much larger than any particular African ethnic or national group. And there are many, many points in time, such as in South Carolina and Georgia and the Sea Island region, where Muslims are a plurality when they're not a majority. In other words, Muslims might be 30 or 40% of the enslaved population. They're not a majority, but they're the largest single group amongst the enslaved, and therefore elements of Islamic culture get preserved in very, very clear ways. My father is actually from Georgia, and we can talk about certain customs that actually relate back to Islam through just ordinary African-American tradition. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that I really encourage you, if you haven't had the chance to look at it, to look at the third chapter of my first book, The Walking Quran, because the title of it is The Book in Chains. And in it, I talk about homegrown West African Islamic abolitionist movements that start in the 1600s and really run full force at the end of the 18th century. So that the first modern nation to actually abolish the slave trade and the institution of slavery within it is actually a clerical republic in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s. A scholar called Abdul Qadir Khan pronounces that any person who's capable of reciting a single verse of the Quran in his territories will be instantly freed. And he forbids European slavers from crossing his territory, and indeed fights an aggressive war against not only those European slavers, but also any African slavers that are complicit with them. In his understanding, not even a single verse of the Book of God should be held in bondage. Now, mind you, that qaf is an ayah, right? So just saying that will be enough to free you. And his position in the oral tradition was that he said that the Muslim that should be protected from the indignities of enslavement is the one that says La ilaha illallah, even if they pronounce it Ra'iraha iraha. In other words, he didn't actually care about verifying a person's profession of faith. For him, simply say the kalima, and the indignity of enslavement is no longer possible for you. It's one of the most poorly understood elements of the Islamic tradition, that we actually have the first modern abolitionist tradition. I'll tell you one other part of this. The founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, in his first book, Letters on the Slave Trade, before, this is in 1789, so 18 years before the 1807 British abolition of the slave trade, right? He writes about Abdul Qadir Khan in his first book, Letters on the Slave Trade, about 30 pages on Abdul Qadir Khan's anti-slavery movement. And he said, the wise and virtuous Almami, because he uses the Fulani term, Al-Imam becomes Almami in Fulani language. So he says, the wise and virtuous Almami has done more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion than any of the sovereigns of Europe. He goes on to say that he was inspired in the foundation of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade by this African Muslim example. Which is, I guarantee you, not how y'all heard that story. Right? Y'all heard that story that Christian do-gooderism was responsible for the abolition of the slave trade, and that Muslims and Africans never had a critical word to say about it. Well, I'm calling BS on that one, and I've got receipts. No, really. So read chapter 3 of the Walking Quran. It's as a historical intervention, it's more fundamental than anything I've written.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. I just got a